everyone. Today I have a really interesting study with potentially really exciting findings. A new study, conducted by researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Space Science and Engineering Center and published in the journal Astrobiology, used spectroscopic analysis to examine the atmosphere of Venus. This was a topic of research because it's actually still rather mysterious. Venus is a strange and violent place, with a toxic 860 degree Fahrenheit atmosphere that's dense with carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and iron chloride. Venus has been researched for more than a century, and the accumulated knowledge describes a planet that's hostile to life in many ways. It's hostile to life on almost all fronts. And yet, according to this new study, Venus might still be able to host microbial life. So, the surface of Venus is a ruinous, scorched wasteland. The atmosphere is so thick, and so much heat has been trapped, that the planet is isothermal. The poles are as hot as the equator, and the nights are just as hot as the days. The only temperature gradients on Venus exist vertically. The atmosphere gets cooler the higher in altitude you go, making the tops of the mountains the coldest places you can reach on foot on Venus. But even above the mountains, the air continues to get cooler and cooler. Similarly, the atmospheric pressure will drop too as you get higher and higher, as the atmosphere thins out further and further away from the surface. Now, there's actually a layer in the Venusian atmosphere, somewhere around 48 to 50 kilometers above the surface, where the temperature is a balmy 60 degrees Celsius, and there's an Earth-like atmospheric pressure. And above this, it only gets cooler, with lower pressure. So you reach this kind of threshold. You reach this floor, where everything below it is inhospitable to life, but everything above it, if humans happen to be living in a floating habitat, floating above this layer of the Venusian atmosphere, it would be comfortable enough that, assuming they were wearing gas masks for oxygen, they would be able to walk out on an open-air balcony and stare out at the Venusian horizon and enjoy the sun, and it would be comfortable. It'd be about, 60 degrees or so, and about 1 atmospheric pressure. As scientists were researching Venus across the last several decades, they noticed that when UV light coming off of Venus is observed, they could see massive patterns that would emerge in the atmosphere that looked like giant planet-spanning regions of lightness and darkness. These were dynamic, ephemeral, moving and shifting, disappearing and reappearing. Conventional models suggested that maybe this was iron chloride and sulfur dioxide that was absorbing ultraviolet light and thus creating all of these amorphous-looking dark regions. But this hasn't been conclusively proven. It hasn't been nailed down for a fact. The study that I want to talk about today is suggesting another explanation for these strange, ephemeral, ultraviolet color differences. The researchers cite a host of recent studies to suggest that maybe some photosynthetic pigment is the known ultraviolet absorber, as there are many known pigments here on Earth that absorb the same wavelengths of light. The irregular, always moving, always changing regions of black and white space of this lightness and darkness, this could be caused by dispersed clouds of microbes moving around in physical space, growing and expanding like algae blooms while floating in their habitable atmosphere, above the dangerous, extreme conditions of the much deeper, lower atmosphere. The researchers calculated that very small microbes, about 1 micrometer in diameter or about the size of a small bacteria, these could float in the atmosphere at a density of about 50 particles per cubic centimeter. And that's actually pretty similar to the density of aerosolized microbes here on Earth, right now. Near the end of their paper, the researchers say, and I quote, "Although speculative, these spectral comparisons are consistent with the potential presence of cloud-based microorganisms containing high abundances of iron-based cofactors," unquote. This is to say that they have come up with a model that suggests that microorganisms live in these clouds in Venus, saturated by these iron chloride particles. They also suggest several Earth-based extremophiles that would be able to thrive in the Venusian climate, like those that can tolerate an anaerobic habitat and the presence of iron chlorides and sulfuric acids. The researchers say, and I quote, "Any potential biomass would clearly be dependent on available water, carbon, and other biogenic nutrients, e.g. sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, boron, and transition metals. The phototropic reduction of atmospheric CO2 would likely be a major source for carbon acquisition, with an attenuated UV flux within the cloud layer providing the driving energy source." Unquote. About the planetary ecology that would support these microbes, the researchers explored an atmospheric circulation model that would see higher-up microbes getting destroyed by UV radiation, and their detritus recirculating in air currents into the lower atmosphere to feed the growth of more microbes. The researchers also talked about the sulfuric acids and the very low pH conditions, and they pointed to A. ferrooxidans as a terrestrial example of a species that can live in such an environment. Now, the researchers don't say outright that they've found life in the clouds of Venus, because they haven't. They haven't found that life. But what they have done is demonstrate a model for how Earth-like biological systems can potentially survive in the Venusian atmosphere. They're putting their hypothesis into the arena of ideas, but they say that more study is needed, especially studies that have access to more sophisticated testing equipment, like the Glenn Extreme Environment Rig at NASA's Glenn Research Center. Personally, I think this proposed model for microbes floating in the Venusian atmosphere is really exciting. It's super cool. This research shows that it's feasible that these microbes really could live here. And if there really was life floating in the clouds of Venus, if we really do discover this on some future space mission, that would be awesome, because that would imply that life can form on even the most hellish of planets.